In the heart of Oregon's lush Willamette National Forest, where towering Douglas firs and ancient oaks created a verdant canopy, lived Maggie, a golden retriever with a coat that shimmered like sunlight filtering through leaves. Her gentle brown eyes held a depth of love that seemed boundless, especially when gazing upon her 5 wriggling, golden-furred puppies. Maggie had carved out a tranquil existence for herself and her little family in this vast wilderness, far from the bustle of human civilization. Their home was a cozy hollow beneath the sprawling roots of an old oak tree, its trunk wider than 3 men could wrap their arms around. The den was lined with soft moss and downy feathers Maggie had carefully collected, creating a warm nest for her puppies. Each morning, as the forest stirred to life with the first rays of sunlight, Maggie would emerge from their den, stretching her lithe body and shaking the dew from her fur. The days followed a simple yet joyous routine. Maggie would lead her curious brood on short adventures through the surrounding woods, teaching them the ways of the forest. She showed them how to sniff out the juiciest berries, how to lap water from clear streams without getting their noses wet, and how to listen for the telltale rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. The puppies, each with their own distinct personality, would tumble after her, yipping with excitement at each new discovery. There was Max, the largest of the litter, always eager to charge ahead and explore. Daisy, the only girl, was more cautious but observant, often the first to notice a butterfly or an interesting leaf. Charlie was the troublemaker, constantly getting tangled in brambles or splashing in puddles. Buddy was the peacekeeper, always trying to break up squabbles between his siblings. And finally, there was Ollie, the runt of the litter, who preferred to stay close to Maggie's side, content to watch his more adventurous siblings. As spring melted into summer, the forest became a playground of wonder for the growing puppies. Maggie would lead them to a sun-dappled meadow not far from their den, where wildflowers painted the grass in a riot of colors. Here, the puppies would chase butterflies, roll in the sweet-smelling clover, and play fight with each other while Maggie kept a watchful eye. She'd occasionally join in their games, her tail wagging with unbridled joy as she gently wrestled with her children or played a game of chase through the tall grass. The forest around them was alive with activity. Squirrels chattered from tree branches, scolding the playful family below. Birds flitted from tree to tree, their songs creating a natural symphony. Occasionally, a deer and her fawn would wander into the meadow, pausing to regard Maggie and her puppies with gentle curiosity before continuing on their way. In the distance, a babbling brook provided a constant, soothing background melody to their days. Maggie's keen senses were always alert for any sign of danger, but in this peaceful corner of the forest, threats seemed far away. The biggest excitement usually came in the form of a passing fox or a swooping owl, which would send the puppies scurrying back to the safety of their mother's side. Maggie would comfort them with gentle nuzzles and soft woofs, teaching them about the natural order of the forest. As the puppies grew stronger and more independent, Maggie began to venture a bit further in her daily foraging trips. She'd leave the puppies safely tucked in their den, returning with her jaws full of berries, roots, and the occasional fish she'd managed to catch from the nearby stream. The puppies would greet her return with enthusiastic yips and wagging tails, eagerly gobbling up the food she brought and listening attentively as she shared the scents and sounds of the wider forest with them. Weeks passed in this idyllic fashion, the little family existing in perfect harmony with the natural world around them. The puppies grew quickly, their fuzzy puppy fur giving way to sleeker coats, their clumsy paws becoming more sure-footed. Maggie watched their progress with pride, her heart swelling with love for each of her children. But as July gave way to August, the forest began to change. The lush greenery of early summer faded, leaves curling at the edges as an unseasonable drought gripped the region. The babbling brook slowed to a trickle, and the once verdant meadow became a sea of brown, crunching underfoot. Maggie noticed these changes with growing unease, her instincts telling her that something wasn't right. The animals of the forest grew quieter, more cautious. Maggie observed fewer deer in the meadow, and the chattering squirrels seemed to have retreated higher into the trees. Even the birds' songs took on a more subdued tone. Despite these warning signs, life continued much as it had for Maggie and her puppies. She was more careful now, keeping her little ones closer to the den and venturing out more frequently to find food and water. It was on one such foraging trip that Maggie first smelled it, a faint, acrid scent carried on the dry wind. Her hackles rose instinctively, a low whine escaping her throat. She quickened her pace back to the den, her nose twitching anxiously as she tried to place the unfamiliar smell. As she approached the old oak tree, a sound unlike anything she'd heard before reached her sensitive ears. It was a low, ominous crackle, distant but growing louder with each passing moment. The forest had fallen eerily silent, as if holding its breath in anticipation of some impending doom. Maggie burst into the den, her heart racing. The puppies, who had been napping in a cozy pile, stirred at her sudden entrance. They sensed their mother's distress immediately, whimpering softly and pressing close to her. Maggie nuzzled each of them in turn, her mind racing as she tried to decide what to do. The crackle grew louder, and now Maggie could see an orange glow on the horizon, visible through gaps in the trees. Smoke began to fill the air, thick and choking. With dawning horror, Maggie realized what was happening. A wildfire was sweeping through the forest, and it was heading straight for them. Panic erupted among the animals of the forest. Deer bounded through the underbrush, their usual grace abandoned in their desperation to escape. Birds took to the skies in great flocks, their alarmed calls filling the air. Smaller mammals scurried past the den, blind in their frantic flight from the approaching inferno. Maggie knew she couldn't afford to panic. Her puppies were looking to her for guidance, their young, trusting eyes wide with fear. She had to get them to safety, but where? The path to their usual meadow was already blocked by flames, and the small stream nearby would offer little protection against the raging fire. Time was slipping away like sand through her pores. The heat was becoming unbearable, and the roar of the fire drowned out all other sounds. Maggie made a split-second decision. Gently but firmly, she herded her puppies out of the den. They huddled close to her legs, trembling but obedient. With one last look at the only home her puppies had ever known, Maggie led her family away from the approaching flames. She moved as quickly as she dared, constantly checking to make sure all 5 puppies were keeping up. The forest, once so familiar and comforting, had become a maze of smoke and terror. As they fled, Maggie's heart pounded with fear and determination. The path to safety was uncertain, but her resolve to save her puppies burned brighter than the fire itself. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Maggie would face them. She had to, for her puppies, for their survival. And so, into the smoke-filled unknown, the golden retriever and her 5 frightened puppies ran, leaving behind the peaceful life they had known and facing a future fraught with danger and uncertainty. The world Maggie and her puppies had known was transforming before their eyes. The once peaceful forest had become a hellscape of smoke and flame. The fire advanced with terrifying speed, its hungry flames leaping from tree to tree as if alive, consuming everything in its path. The heat was unbearable, pressing against them like a physical force, and Maggie's ears twitched at the cacophony of snapping branches and the occasional thunderous collapse of burning trees. Maggie's puppies clung to her side, their young, trusting eyes looking to her for guidance even as fear made their little bodies tremble. Max, usually the bravest, whimpered softly as he pressed against his mother's leg. Daisy's observant eyes darted around wildly, trying to make sense of the chaos. Charlie, for once, wasn't causing mischief but staying uncharacteristically close to his siblings. Buddy, true to his nature, was trying to comfort Ollie, who was struggling to keep up with the group. The golden retriever's heart ached for her children, but she knew she couldn't afford to slow down. Every instinct screamed at her to run faster, to get as far away from the danger as possible. But Maggie tempered her pace, knowing her puppies couldn't match her full speed. She alternated between nudging them forward and pausing to make sure all 5 were still with her. As they ran, the once familiar terrain became a maze of smoke and fire. Landmarks Maggie had used to navigate the forest were either obscured by the thick smoke or completely destroyed by the flames. She relied on her keen sense of smell to guide them, but even that was becoming unreliable as the acrid smoke burned her nostrils and made her eyes water. The family darted through the forest, Maggie desperately searching for a way out. Her lungs burned with each breath, the hot air searing her throat. She could hear her puppies panting heavily behind her, and worry gnawed at her heart. How much longer could they keep this pace? Suddenly, through a break in the smoke, Maggie saw a glimmer of hope. She recognized a shallow river up ahead, one she had often visited during her foraging trips. The water wasn't deep, but it could provide a safe passage away from the flames. Gathering as much strength as she could, Maggie barked encouragingly at her puppies to follow her lead. But the fire, cruel and unpredictable, seemed determined to thwart their escape. Just as they approached the river's edge, a massive, burning pine tree crashed down mere feet in front of them. Maggie skidded to a halt, her puppies bumping into her legs in their confusion. The fallen tree blocked their access to the river, sending a shower of glowing embers spinning into the air. Without hesitation, Maggie immediately shielded her pups with her own body. She felt the hot embers singe her fur, but she didn't flinch. Her puppies' safety was all that mattered. As the embers died down, Maggie quickly assessed their situation. The river was no longer an option, but they couldn't stay where they were. The fire was closing in on all sides. Maggie made a split-second decision. She gently but firmly herded her puppies towards a small hollow beneath some rocks nearby. It wasn't much, but it would offer some protection from the flying embers and intense heat. Once her puppies were huddled in the relative safety of the hollow, Maggie knew what she had to do. She turned to Max, her firstborn and the strongest of the litter. With gentle nudges and soft woofs, she communicated as best she could, urging him to watch over his siblings. Max's eyes, so much like her own, met hers with understanding beyond his young age. He positioned himself at the entrance of the hollow, ready to guard his brothers and sister. Then, steeling herself for what was to come, Maggie carefully picked up Ollie, the smallest of her puppies, by the scruff of his neck. With one last look at her other 4 children, she set off into the inferno. Her goal was clear: find a safe path through the fire and come back for the rest of her puppies. The journey was harrowing. The smoke was thicker than ever, and Maggie had to stay low to the ground to find pockets of clearer air. She could feel Ollie trembling in her grasp, but the little pup remained bravely quiet. Maggie's eyes darted left and right, searching for any break in the wall of flames surrounding them. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, Maggie spotted a small clearing where the fire hadn't yet reached. She carefully set Ollie down, nudging him towards a small depression in the ground where he would be as safe as possible. Ollie looked up at her with wide, frightened eyes, but a gentle lick from Maggie seemed to reassure him. He curled up in the depression, his trust in his mother evident even in this terrifying situation. Without wasting a moment, Maggie turned and raced back towards the hollow where her other puppies waited. The return journey seemed even more dangerous, as the fire had spread further in her absence. She had to detour several times to avoid fallen trees and walls of flame, her heart pounding with the fear that she might not be able to find her way back to the hollow. But Maggie's determination was stronger than her fear. She finally spotted the rocks that marked the hollow, and relief flooded through her as she saw Max still standing guard at the entrance. As she approached, her 4 remaining puppies tumbled out to meet her, whimpering with a mixture of fear and joy at her return. There was no time for reunions, however. Maggie quickly picked up Charlie, the next smallest after Ollie, and began the treacherous journey once more. This time, knowing the relatively safer path, she moved faster, her muscles straining with the effort of carrying her puppy and navigating the obstacle course the forest had become. She deposited Charlie next to Ollie, pausing only long enough to give them both a quick, reassuring nuzzle before turning back. The air was getting hotter, the smoke thicker, and Maggie's lungs felt like they were on fire. But she pushed on, driven by the knowledge that 3 of her puppies were still in danger. On her 3rd trip, Maggie collected Buddy. The usually peaceable pup was uncharacteristically agitated, picking up on the stress and fear around him. Maggie did her best to calm him as she carried him, her soothing whines almost lost in the roar of the fire. When she placed him with Ollie and Charlie, Buddy immediately huddled close to his brothers, his presence seeming to calm them all. By the time Maggie made her 4th trip, the fire had advanced alarmingly close to the hollow. Max and Daisy were huddled together at the very back of the small space, their eyes wide with terror. Maggie's heart clenched at the sight, but she forced herself to focus. She gently grasped Daisy, her only daughter, and began the now familiar route once more. This journey was the hardest yet. Maggie's strength was flagging, her paw pads burned and painful, and each breath was a struggle against the thick smoke. But the thought of her puppies kept her going. She couldn't fail them now, not when they were so close to safety. When she finally placed Daisy with her other siblings, Maggie allowed herself a moment of relief. 4 of her puppies were now in the clearing, relatively safe from the worst of the fire. But she couldn't rest yet. Max was still waiting for her, alone in the hollow that had once been their home. Gathering the last reserves of her strength, Maggie turned back one final time. The forest was now almost unrecognizable, a nightmarish landscape of fire and smoke. Trees that had stood for hundreds of years were reduced to burning husks, crashing to the ground with terrifying frequency. The heat was so intense that Maggie felt as if her very fur might ignite. But none of that mattered. All that mattered was reaching Max and bringing him to safety. Maggie pushed her battered body to its limits, retracing her path with grim determination. When she finally reached the hollow, she found Max exactly where she had left him, still guarding the now empty space. As soon as he saw her, the brave pup rushed to her side. Maggie wasted no time. She picked Max up, noting with a pang how much heavier he was than his siblings. Her jaw ached with the effort of carrying him, but she set off nonetheless. This last trip seemed to take an eternity. Maggie's vision was blurring, whether from the smoke or sheer exhaustion she couldn't tell. Her steps became unsteady, and more than once she stumbled, barely keeping her grip on maximum. Just when Maggie thought she couldn't take another step, she heard a sound that cut through the roar of the fire, the whimpering of her puppies. Somehow, she had made it back to the clearing. With the last of her strength, she set Max down next to his siblings. As her 5 puppies huddled around her, Maggie finally allowed herself to collapse. Her body was trembling with exhaustion, her fur singed and her paw pads blistered and bleeding. But as she looked at her puppies, all 5 safe and alive, a wave of relief washed over her. They were together, and for now, they were safe from the worst of the fire. But Maggie knew they weren't out of danger yet. The fire was still advancing, and sooner or later, it would reach their little sanctuary. She needed to find a way to get her puppies to true safety. As she lay there, her mind racing despite her body's exhaustion, Maggie's keen ears picked up a new sound, one that didn't belong to the forest or the fire. It was a mechanical whirring, accompanied by human voices. Under normal circumstances, Maggie would have been wary of human presence. But now, battered and desperate, she recognized it for what it was: hope. Humans meant help, and help was exactly what she and her puppies needed. Maggie struggled to her feet, ignoring the pain that shot through her body. She gave each of her puppies an encouraging nuzzle, silently urging them to stay strong for just a little longer. Then, gathering every last ounce of strength she possessed, Maggie lifted her head and let out a long, loud howl. It was a sound filled with desperation and hope, a plea for help that rose above the crackling of the flames. As her howl faded, Maggie listened intently, praying that someone, anyone, had heard her cry. Her puppies pressed close around her, their small bodies trembling but their spirits unbroken. Together, the little family waited, hoping against hope that rescue was on its way. As Maggie's howl echoed through the smoke-filled air, it reached the ears of firefighter John Miller and his team. They had been cutting through the dense smoke, searching for any survivors, human or animal, caught in the path of the raging wildfire. John, a seasoned firefighter with the Willamette Valley Fire Department, had seen his fair share of forest fires, but this one was particularly vicious. "Did you hear that?" John called out to his team, his voice muffled by his oxygen mask. The other firefighters paused, straining to hear over the roar of the flames and the mechanical whir of their equipment. Then, faintly, they heard it again, a desperate howl carried on the wind. "That's gotta be a dog," said Sarah, one of the younger members of the team. Her eyes, visible through her mask, were wide with concern. "It sounds close." John nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Let's move in that direction. Be careful, the fire's unpredictable here." The team moved forward cautiously, their heavy boots crunching on the charred remains of the forest floor. The heat was intense, even through their protective gear, and sweat ran down their faces inside their masks. But they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that lives might depend on their actions. As they pushed through a particularly thick patch of smoke, John's sharp eyes caught a flicker of movement. He signaled for the team to stop and peered intently into the haze. There, barely visible through the smoke, was a flash of golden fur. "There!" John shouted, pointing. "I see something." The team moved forward as one, and as the smoke cleared slightly, they saw a sight that made their hearts clench. A golden retriever, her fur singed and her body trembling with exhaustion, stood protectively over 5 small puppies. The dog's eyes locked onto John, and he saw in them an unmistakable plea for help. "Maggie," John called out, his voice firm yet calm. He didn't know why he called her that, it just seemed to fit. "It's okay, girl. We're here to help." Maggie seemed to understand. With the last reserves of her strength, she limped towards John, her puppies huddled close to her legs. As they drew nearer, John could see the extent of Maggie's injuries. Her paw pads were raw and bleeding, her fur was singed in multiple places, and her breathing was labored. "We need to get them out of here now," John said to his team. "The fire's closing in fast." Sarah stepped forward, her arms already outstretched to help. "I'll take some of the puppies," she offered. John nodded gratefully. "Okay, let's move quickly but carefully. These little ones have been through enough already." As the team began to gather the puppies, a voice crackled over their radios. "Miller, what's your status? Fire's shifting your way, you need to pull out now." John pressed his radio. "Copy that, command. We've found survivors, a dog and 5 puppies. We're bringing them out now." There was a moment of static before the reply came. "Understood, Miller. Get them and yourselves out of there ASAP. We've got an animal rescue team standing by at the base camp." With practiced efficiency, the firefighters gently scooped up the puppies. The little ones whimpered, scared by the strangers and the unfamiliar sensation of being carried, but they were too exhausted to put up much of a fuss. Maggie watched anxiously, her eyes darting between her puppies and the firefighters. "It's okay, Maggie," John soothed, kneeling down beside her. "We're going to get you all out of here. Can you walk?" Maggie took a tentative step, but her legs buckled beneath her. Without hesitation, John scooped her up into his arms. Despite her size, she felt surprisingly light, a testament to the ordeal she'd been through. "All right, team, let's move out," John ordered. The journey back through the burning forest was tense and treacherous. The fire had spread further, cutting off their original path. They were forced to take a longer route, carefully picking their way through less affected areas. All the while, the puppies whimpered softly, and Maggie trembled in John's arms, her eyes never leaving her babies. After what felt like hours but was probably only about 20 minutes, they finally broke through the tree line. The sight that greeted them was one of organized chaos. Fire trucks and emergency vehicles were parked in a makeshift camp, their lights flashing against the smoky sky. Firefighters and emergency personnel rushed back and forth, coordinating efforts to contain the blaze. As soon as they were spotted, a team of paramedics and veterinarians rushed towards them. Among them was Dr. Rachel Thompson, a local vet who had volunteered to assist with any animal rescues. "Over here," Rachel called out, directing them to a tent that had been set up for animal triage. "Bring them in quickly." Inside the tent, Rachel and her team sprang into action. They gently took the puppies from the firefighters, placing them on soft blankets and beginning immediate examinations. John carefully set Maggie down on an examination table, but the exhausted dog tried to struggle to her feet, her eyes frantically searching for her puppies. "Easy, girl," Rachel soothed, gently restraining Maggie. "Your babies are right here, see? We're going to take good care of all of you." As Rachel began to assess Maggie's condition, John hovered nearby, unable to tear himself away. There was something about this brave dog that had touched his heart. He watched as Rachel carefully cleaned and treated Maggie's burned paw pads, applied soothing ointment to her singed fur, and set up an IV to combat dehydration. "How is she, Doc?" John asked, his voice rough with concern. Rachel looked up, her expression a mix of worry and cautious optimism. "She's been through hell, that's for sure. Burns, smoke inhalation, extreme exhaustion. But she's strong. With proper care, I think she'll pull through." John nodded, relief washing over him. "And the puppies? They're in better shape, thanks to their mama here," Rachel said, giving Maggie a gentle pat. "She kept them safe from the worst of it. They're dehydrated and scared, but they should be fine with some TLC." As if on cue, one of the puppies, the smallest one, let out a tiny bark. Maggie's head shot up, Her ears perked despite her exhaustion. Rachel chuckled softly. "I think someone wants their mom," she said. "John, could you bring that little one over here? I think it'll do them both some good to be close." John carefully picked up the smallest puppy, Ollie, though he didn't know the pup's name, and brought him to Maggie. As soon as he placed the puppy next to her, Maggie began to gently nuzzle and lick him, her whole body seeming to relax. Ollie snuggled into his mother's side, his tiny tail wagging weakly. Watching this reunion, John felt a lump form in his throat. He'd seen a lot of tough situations in his years as a firefighter, but there was something about the bond between this mother dog and her puppies that struck a deep chord within him. "You did good, Maggie," he murmured, reaching out to gently scratch behind her ears. "You're a real hero, you know that?" Maggie looked up at him, her brown eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and what John could have sworn was gratitude. Then she laid her head back down, curling protectively around Ollie. Over the next few hours, the base camp was a flurry of activity. More animals were brought in, rescued from the path of the fire. The blaze itself continued to rage, with firefighters working tirelessly to contain it. But in the animal rescue tent, a small miracle was unfolding. Under Rachel's expert care, Maggie and her puppies began to show signs of improvement. The puppies, once they were rehydrated and fed, became more active, their little tails wagging and their yips filling the tent with hope. Maggie remained protective, keeping a watchful eye on her brood even as she submitted to Rachel's treatments. As his shift ended and a new team took over firefighting duties, John found himself returning to the tent. He was drawn to Maggie and her puppies, feeling a connection he couldn't quite explain. Rachel spotted him as he entered and smiled knowingly. "Back again," she teased gently. "Can't stay away, huh?" John shrugged, a bit embarrassed. "Just wanted to check on them. How are they doing?" "See for yourself," Rachel said, gesturing to where Maggie lay. The scene before him warmed John's heart. Maggie was curled up on a large, soft bed, all 5 of her puppies snuggled against her. They were all sleeping peacefully, their little chests rising and falling in unison. Maggie's eyes were closed, but as John approached, one eye cracked open, watching him carefully. "Hey there, beautiful," John said softly, crouching down beside the bed. "You're looking better already." Maggie's tail thumped weakly against the bed, and she let out a soft whine. John reached out slowly, letting her sniff his hand before he gently stroked her head. To his surprise and delight, Maggie leaned into his touch, seemingly appreciating the comfort. "You know," Rachel said, coming to stand beside John, "we're going to need to find homes for them once they're recovered. The local shelters are already overcrowded, and with this fire, it's only going to get worse." John nodded, his mind already racing. He had a modest house with a big backyard, and he'd been thinking about getting a dog for a while now. But could he really take on a mother dog and 5 puppies? As if sensing his thoughts, Maggie lifted her head and looked directly into John's eyes. In that moment, he felt a connection, a sense of understanding passing between them. This brave, devoted mother had risked everything to save her puppies. How could he not do everything in his power to help her? "I'll take them," John heard himself say, almost before he realized he'd made the decision. "All of them. At least until we can find good homes for the puppies." "But Maggie?" "I think Maggie might have already found her forever home." Rachel's eyes widened in surprise, then crinkled with joy. "John, that's wonderful. Are you sure? It's a big responsibility." John nodded, feeling more certain by the second. "I'm sure. These guys have been through so much. They deserve a safe place to recover, and I've got plenty of space. Plus," he added with a grin, "I think Maggie here has already decided she's keeping me." As if in agreement, Maggie let out a soft woof and licked John's hand. The puppies, stirred by their mother's movement, began to wiggle and yip, their little paws flailing in the air. Rachel laughed, the sound bright and hopeful in the midst of the day's darkness. "Well, it looks like it's settled then. Congratulations, John. I think you've just become a dog dad, times 6. As John sat there, surrounded by Maggie and her puppies, he felt a sense of purpose wash over him. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, the puppies would need a lot of care, and Maggie still had a long recovery ahead of her. But looking into Maggie's trusting eyes, John knew that together, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Outside the tent, the forest fire continued to burn, a reminder of the destructive forces of nature. But here, in this small haven of safety, a new family had been forged in the flames. It was a testament to the resilience of life, the depth of a mother's love, and the unexpected bonds that can form in the face of adversity. For John, Maggie, and the puppies, it was not an end, but a new beginning. The days following the dramatic rescue were a whirlwind of activity for John Miller. After his shift ended and the immediate danger of the wildfire had passed, he found himself navigating the unfamiliar waters of pet ownership, and not just for one dog, but for a mother and her 5 puppies. The local veterinary clinic, where Dr. Rachel Thompson worked, became a second home as Maggie and her pups received ongoing treatment for their injuries and the effects of smoke inhalation. John visited the clinic every day, often spending hours sitting beside Maggie's bed, talking softly to her and the puppies. He'd never considered himself much of a dog person before, but there was something about Maggie's warm brown eyes and gentle demeanor that touched his heart. The puppies, too, were impossible not to love. As they recovered their strength, their individual personalities began to shine through. There was Max, the largest of the litter, always first in line for food and attention. Daisy, the only girl, was quieter but incredibly observant, her eyes following every movement in the room. Charlie was the troublemaker, constantly trying to escape his enclosure to explore. Buddy lived up to his name, always trying to comfort his siblings when they were distressed. And then there was little Ollie, the runt of the litter, who seemed to have formed a special bond with John, often falling asleep in his lap during visits. As Maggie's condition improved, Rachel began discussing the possibility of releasing her and the puppies into John's care. "They're doing well," she explained during one of John's visits. "Maggie's burns are healing nicely, and the puppies have bounced back remarkably. I think they're ready to go home with you." John felt a mix of excitement and nervousness at the prospect. His house, while spacious, had never been home to a dog before, let alone 6. "Are you sure they're ready?" he asked, watching as Maggie gently nuzzled Ollie. "And am I ready?" Rachel laughed, patting John on the shoulder. "John, I've seen you with them. You're more than ready. And they need a stable environment to continue their recovery. Your home will be perfect." So it was that a week after the rescue, John found himself driving home with his truck full of dogs. Maggie sat in the passenger seat, her head held high despite her still healing injuries, while the puppies were secured in a large crate in the back. As they pulled up to John's modest 2-story house in a quiet suburb of Salem, Oregon, he couldn't help but feel like his life was about to change dramatically. The first few days were chaotic, to say the least. John had done his best to puppy-proof the house, but he quickly discovered that 5 curious puppies could find trouble in the most unexpected places. There were accidents to clean up, shoes to rescue from tiny teeth, and countless objects knocked over by wagging tails. But through it all, Maggie was a calm presence, seemingly grateful for the safety and comfort of a real home. John set up a cozy corner in the living room with beds for Maggie and the puppies, but he soon found that they preferred to sleep huddled together. More often than not, he'd wake up in the morning to find that Maggie had somehow managed to lead all 5 puppies up onto his bed during the night. As the days turned into weeks, a routine began to establish itself. John would wake up early, taking Maggie and the puppies out for a morning walk around the neighborhood. His neighbors quickly became accustomed to the sight of the burly firefighter being led down the street by a golden retriever and a wriggling mass of puppies. Then it was time for breakfast, a chaotic affair that often left John's kitchen looking like a war zone, followed by playtime in the backyard. John found himself looking forward to coming home after his shifts at the fire station. The house, once quiet and sometimes lonely, was now full of life and energy. He'd spend his evenings playing with the puppies, taking them for walks, and sitting on the porch with Maggie by his side, watching the sun set over the Willamette Valley. But just as things were settling into a comfortable rhythm, a complication arose that threatened to disrupt the peace of their new family. It was a sunny Saturday morning when the doorbell rang. John, in the middle of refereeing a tug-of-war game between Max and Charlie over a chew toy, answered the door to find a man he didn't recognize standing on his porch. "Can I help you?" John asked, reflexively blocking the doorway as Maggie came up beside him, her posture alert but not aggressive. The man, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt, smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Mark Hansen," he said, his voice gruff. "I'm here about my dog." John felt a chill run down his spine. "Your dog?" Mark nodded, his eyes fixed on Maggie. "That's my Golden right there. She ran away from my property a few months back. Been looking for her ever since." John's mind raced. He'd never considered the possibility that Maggie might have had a previous owner. She'd been alone in the forest with her puppies, after all. But as he looked at Maggie, he saw that she had shrunk back slightly, her tail tucked between her legs. It wasn't the reaction he'd expect from a dog reunited with a beloved owner. "I'm sorry, but I think there must be some mistake," John said carefully. "This is Maggie. My team and I rescued her and her puppies from the wildfire a few weeks ago." Mark's expression hardened. "No mistake. That's my dog, and I want her back. Got the papers to prove it too." He pulled out a folded document from his back pocket. "Registration and everything. Her name's actually Goldie, not Maggie." John took the paper, his heart sinking as he saw that it did indeed appear to be a legitimate dog registration for a golden retriever that matched Maggie's description. But something didn't feel right. Maggie's reaction, the fact that she'd been alone in the forest, the cold way Mark looked at her, it all set off alarm bells in John's firefighter-honed instincts. "Look, Mr. Hansen," John said, handing the paper back, "this is a complicated situation. Maggie, or Goldie, has been through a lot. She and her puppies nearly died in that fire. They're still recovering. I can't just hand her over without making sure everything's above board." Mark's face flushed with anger. "Are you accusing me of something? That's my dog, and I have the right to take her home." Before John could respond, he felt a tug on his pant leg. Looking down, he saw little Ollie, who had managed to squeeze past him to the door. The smallest puppy looked up at Mark and let out a tiny, defiant bark before huddling closer to John's leg. The moment seemed to diffuse some of the tension. Mark's expression softened slightly as he looked at the puppy. "I didn't know she had pups," he mumbled. John saw an opportunity. "Like I said, it's complicated. Why don't you leave your contact information with me? I'll have the local authorities verify everything, and we can figure out the best solution for Maggie and the puppies." Mark hesitated, then nodded grudgingly. He scribbled his phone number on a scrap of paper and handed it to John. "Fine. But I'll be back. That's my dog, and I aim to have her home where she belongs." As Mark turned and walked away, John closed the door and leaned against it, his mind whirling. He looked down at Maggie, who was nuzzling Ollie as if to comfort him. "Don't worry, girl," he said softly, crouching down to pet her. "We'll figure this out. I promise." Over the next few days, John found himself caught in a whirlwind of legal and ethical questions. He reached out to Rachel at the vet clinic, explaining the situation and asking for her advice. "It's a tricky situation," Rachel admitted when they met for coffee to discuss the issue. "Legally, if he can prove ownership, he has a right to reclaim Maggie. But given the circumstances, her condition when you found her, her reaction to this Mark person, I have some concerns." John nodded, his face grim. "So do I." Maggie was terrified of him, Rachel. And the way he looked at her, it wasn't the way you'd look at a beloved pet you'd been searching for. Rachel's brow furrowed in thought. "Have you considered that there might be more to the story? If Maggie or Goldie ran away, there might have been a reason." The implication hung heavy in the air between them. John had been a firefighter long enough to know that not all homes were safe, for humans or animals. The thought of Maggie possibly suffering abuse made his blood boil. "What can we do?" he asked, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. Rachel reached across the table, placing her hand on John's arm. "First, we verify his claim. I can check if the microchip number on the registration he showed you matches any in our database. Then, if it does, we might need to involve animal control to do a welfare check on his property. If there's any evidence of neglect or abuse." John nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. "That could give us grounds to deny his claim." "Potentially," Rachel said cautiously. "But John, we need to be prepared for the possibility that we might not find anything concrete. These cases can be complicated." As they continued to talk, formulating a plan, John couldn't help but think of Maggie and the puppies waiting for him at home. In just a few short weeks, they had become such an integral part of his life. The thought of losing them, especially to someone who might not have their best interests at heart, was almost unbearable. But John was a fighter, both in his job and in his personal life. He had faced down raging infernos and walked into burning buildings to save lives. He wasn't about to give up on Maggie and her puppies without a fight. As he left the coffee shop, his resolve strengthened. He would do whatever it took to protect his new family. He would navigate the legal channels, work with Rachel and the authorities, and if necessary, he would face down Mark Hansen himself. Because somewhere between the smoke-filled forest and his cozy living room, Maggie and her puppies had become more than just rescued animals. They had become his family. And John Miller was not a man who gave up on family easily. With a determined set to his jaw, John headed home, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As he pulled into his driveway, he could hear the excited yips of the puppies and Maggie's deep, welcoming bark. And he knew, without a doubt, that this was a fight worth fighting. As the legal battle over Maggie's ownership unfolded, an unexpected silver lining emerged from the cloud of uncertainty. The local Salem newspaper, always on the lookout for a heartwarming story, caught wind of the brave golden retriever who had saved her puppies from a wildfire, only to face a new challenge in the form of a custody dispute. The article, complete with adorable photos of Maggie and her puppies, spread like wildfire through the community and beyond. John found himself at the center of a whirlwind of attention. His phone rang off the hook with calls from neighbors, fellow firefighters, and even strangers who had been touched by Maggie's story. Many offered support, legal advice, and even financial assistance to help with the mounting legal fees. But it was Rachel who saw the bigger picture. "John," she said during one of their strategy sessions, her eyes bright with excitement, "don't you see? This isn't just about Maggie anymore. Her story has struck a chord with people. We could use this momentum to help other animals in need." And so, even as they continued to fight for Maggie's future, John and Rachel launched a rescue campaign they called Maggie's Flame of Hope. The initiative focused on abandoned and mistreated animals, with a particular emphasis on those displaced by natural disasters like the wildfire that had nearly claimed Maggie and her puppies. The campaign started small, with a fundraiser at the local firehouse. John's colleagues rallied around the cause, setting up a barbecue and bringing their families. Maggie and the puppies were the stars of the show, with kids and adults alike lining up to pet them and hear their story. By the end of the day, they had raised several $1,000s and collected a small mountain of pet food and supplies for the local animal shelter. Encouraged by this success, John and Rachel expanded their efforts. They partnered with local businesses to set up donation bins for pet supplies. They organized volunteer days at the animal shelter, where people could help walk dogs, socialize cats, and assist with basic care tasks. And they continued to share Maggie's story, using it as a catalyst to raise awareness about animal welfare issues. As the campaign grew, so did its impact. The local animal shelter, which had been chronically underfunded and overcrowded, saw a surge in adoptions and foster care applications. People who had never considered adopting a pet before were inspired by Maggie's story to open their homes to animals in need. One Saturday morning, as John was setting up for another fundraiser at a local park, he was approached by a young girl clutching a piggy bank. Her name was Emily, and she couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. "Mr. Firefighter," she said solemnly, holding out the piggy bank, "I want to give this to help the animals like Maggie. I've been saving for a new bike, but I think the dogs and cats need it more." John knelt down to her level, deeply touched by the child's generosity. "That's incredibly kind of you, Emily. Are you sure you want to give all of it?" Emily nodded firmly. "Maggie was brave and helped her puppies. Now I want to be brave and help other animals." It was moments like these that reinforced John's belief in the power of Maggie's story. He accepted Emily's donation with heartfelt thanks, making sure to introduce her to Maggie and the puppies as a special reward for her generosity. As the campaign gained momentum, it caught the attention of local media outlets. The Salem Statesman-Journal ran a feature article on Maggie's Flame of Hope, complete with an interview with John and adorable photos of Maggie and her growing puppies. The story was picked up by a Portland news station, bringing Maggie's tale to an even wider audience. The increased publicity brought both benefits and challenges. On one hand, it led to a flood of donations and support for the campaign. On the other, it put additional pressure on the ongoing legal battle with Mark Hansen. Mark, seeing the attention Maggie was receiving, became more insistent in his claims. He gave interviews to counter John's story, painting himself as a heartbroken pet owner just trying to reclaim his lost dog. But his narrative didn't quite ring true, especially when compared to the obvious bond between Maggie and John. Despite the stress of the legal proceedings, John refused to let it dampen the positive impact of the campaign. He threw himself into the work, balancing his duties as a firefighter with his new role as an animal welfare advocate. The puppies, now growing rapidly and full of energy, became regulars at campaign events, charming everyone they met. One particularly memorable event was a joint effort between Maggie's Flame of Hope and the local elementary school. John and Rachel organized a day of education about pet care and fire safety, with Maggie as the star guest. The children were enthralled as John told Maggie's story, using it as a way to teach about both animal welfare and fire prevention. Maggie was very brave, John explained to the wide-eyed students, but we don't want other animals to be in danger like she was. That's why it's so important to be careful with fire, and to have a plan to keep your pet safe in an emergency. The children asked dozens of questions, their natural curiosity and love for animals shining through. Many of them drew pictures of Maggie and her puppies, which John proudly displayed at the next fundraiser. As the campaign grew, so did the network of supporters. Local veterinarians offered discounted services for rescued animals. Pet stores donated food and supplies. Even the mayor of Salem got involved, declaring a Maggie Day to promote animal welfare and fire safety awareness. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the lives of individual animals. Thanks to the increased awareness and resources brought by Maggie's Flame of Hope, dozens of dogs and cats found new homes. There was old Tom, a senior cat who had been overlooked at the shelter for months until a family inspired by Maggie's story decided to give him a chance. And Bella, a three-legged pit bull who had been considered unadoptable until a young couple saw her story on the campaign's social media page and fell in love. Each success story added fuel to the campaign's fire. John found himself moved to tears more than once as he witnessed the transformative power of compassion and community support. One evening, as John sat on his porch with Maggie at his feet and the puppies playing in the yard, Rachel joined him, a look of excitement on her face. "John, you won't believe this," she said, barely containing her enthusiasm. "Remember that grant application we submitted to the State Animal Welfare Board? We got it. They're giving us funding to expand the campaign statewide." John's eyes widened in surprise. "Statewide? Rachel, that's incredible." She nodded, her eyes shining. "It gets better. They want Maggie to be the official mascot for a new fire safety and animal rescue awareness program. They're talking about posters, school visits, the works." As the news sank in, John looked down at Maggie, who gazed back at him with her warm brown eyes. He remembered the day he had found her in the burning forest, protecting her puppies with fierce determination. Now, months later, her bravery was still inspiring others and making a real difference in the world. "What do you think, girl?" he asked softly, scratching behind her ears. "Ready to be a statewide celebrity?" Maggie's tail thumped against the porch in response, and John couldn't help but laugh. From a desperate fight for survival to a symbol of hope for animals across Oregon, Maggie had come so far, and her journey was far from over. As the sun set over Salem, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, John felt a profound sense of gratitude. The path ahead was still uncertain, with the legal battle over Maggie's ownership looming on the horizon. But in this moment, surrounded by the family he had never expected and buoyed by the support of an entire community, John felt hopeful. Maggie's story had ignited a flame of compassion and action that was spreading far beyond what he could have imagined. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, John knew that this flame of hope would continue to burn bright, lighting the way for animals in need and the humans who loved them. As if sensing his thoughts, Maggie stood up and pressed her head against John's leg. He smiled, running his hand along her soft fur. "You're right, girl," he said softly. "We've got work to do. But together, we can make a real difference." With renewed determination, John began to plan the next phase of Maggie's flame of hope. The journey ahead would be challenging, but with Maggie by his side and a community of supporters behind them, he knew they could face anything. The flame that had started with one brave dog in a burning forest was now a beacon of hope for animals across Oregon, and its light was only growing stronger. As autumn painted the Willamette Valley in vibrant hues of red and gold, the legal battle over Maggie's ownership finally came to a close. The case had dragged on for months, filled with tense courtroom debates and anxious waiting. But in the end, justice prevailed. The turning point came when Rachel's diligent investigation uncovered a history of animal neglect complaints against Mark Hansen. This, combined with testimony from neighbors who had witnessed Mark's poor treatment of animals in the past, was enough to convince the judge that Maggie's best interests lay with John. On a crisp October morning, John stood before the judge, his heart pounding as he awaited the final verdict. When the judge ruled in his favor, granting him full legal ownership of Maggie, the relief that washed over him was overwhelming. Rachel, who had been sitting in the gallery, let out a joyful whoop that earned her a stern look from the bailiff, but John couldn't bring himself to care. Maggie was his, legally and officially. As John left the courthouse, he found a small crowd of supporters waiting for him. News of the verdict had spread quickly, and well-wishers had gathered to celebrate. Among them was Emily, the little girl who had donated her piggy bank savings to the cause. She rushed forward, wrapping her arms around John's legs in a tight hug. "Did you win, Mr. Firefighter? Does Maggie get to stay with you?" she asked, her eyes wide with hope. John knelt down, smiling broadly. "Yes, Emily. Maggie's staying with us for good." The girl's answering cheer seemed to sum up the mood of everyone present. There were hugs, handshakes, and more than a few happy tears as the news sank in. John felt a profound sense of gratitude for this community that had rallied around him and Maggie. The drive home was a blur of emotion for John. As he pulled into his driveway, he could hear Maggie's excited barks from inside the house. His neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who had been dog-sitting, opened the door with a knowing smile. "I think someone's eager to see you," she said, stepping aside as Maggie bounded out, her whole body wiggling with joy. John dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around the golden retriever. "Hey, girl," he murmured into her fur. "We did it. You're home for good now." As if understanding the significance of the moment, Maggie let out a soft woof and licked John's face. From inside the house came the sound of scampering paws, and soon John found himself surrounded by not just Maggie, but Max as well. Max, the sole survivor of Maggie's litter, had grown into a handsome young dog. While the other puppies had found loving homes through the Maggie's Flame of Hope campaign, John had found himself unable to part with Maximum. The bond between mother and son was so strong, and Max had become such a part of their little family, that separating them had seemed unthinkable. Now, as John knelt in his front yard, embraced by both Maggie and Max, he felt a sense of completion. This was his family, unexpected and unconventional as it might be, and he wouldn't have it any other way. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. With the legal battle behind them, John and Rachel threw themselves into expanding Maggie's Flame of Hope. The campaign, which had started as a small local initiative, was now gaining recognition across Oregon and even in neighboring states. Maggie, now officially the face of the campaign, took to her new role with grace. She and Max became regulars at schools, community centers, and public events, where John would share their story and teach about animal welfare and fire safety. Children were particularly drawn to the gentle golden retrievers, and it wasn't uncommon to see Maggie and Max surrounded by a group of kids, all eager for a chance to pet them. One particularly memorable event was a visit to a shelter for families displaced by wildfires. Many of the children there had lost pets in the fires, and the pain of those losses was still fresh. But as Maggie and Max made their rounds, their calm presence seemed to offer comfort. John watched with a lump in his throat as a young boy, who hadn't spoken since arriving at the shelter, began to softly talk to Maggie, telling her about the dog he had lost. These moments reinforced for John the importance of their work. Maggie and Max weren't just mascots, they were living symbols of resilience and hope. Their story touched people in ways that went beyond words, offering comfort and inspiring action. As winter approached, bringing with it the promise of cozy evenings by the fire, John found himself reflecting on the incredible journey of the past year. He thought of that terrifying day in the burning forest, of the legal battle that had tested his resolve, and of the countless lives that had been touched by Maggie's story. One snowy evening, as John sat on his porch swing with Maggie and Max curled up at his feet, Rachel joined him, 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate in her hands. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, handing him a mug and settling beside him. John smiled, taking a sip of the rich, warm drink. "Just thinking about how much has changed. A year ago, I was a confirmed bachelor married to my job. Now look at me, a dog dad and running a statewide animal welfare campaign." Rachel laughed softly. "Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? But I've got to say, John, fatherhood suits you." As if to agree, Maggie raised her head and gave a soft woof. John reached down to scratch behind her ears, marveling at the silky softness of her fur. Her coat, once singed and matted from the fire, now gleamed with health. "You know," John said thoughtfully, "I always thought I was rescuing Maggie that day in the forest. But the truth is, she rescued me too. She and Max, they've given me a purpose beyond just fighting fires. They've shown me what it means to have a family." Rachel nodded, her eyes warm with understanding. "That's the magic of animals, isn't it? They have this incredible capacity to heal us, to make us better versions of ourselves." As they sat in companionable silence, watching the snow fall gently around them, John felt a deep sense of contentment. The future stretched out before them, full of possibilities. The Maggie's Flame of Hope campaign was growing, touching more lives every day. There were plans for a new wing at the local animal shelter, funded in part by their fundraising efforts. And there were whispers of turning Maggie's story into a children's book, to inspire a new generation of animal lovers. But beyond all the public achievements, it was the quieter, personal moments that John treasured most. The early morning walks with Maggie and Max, their breaths forming little clouds in the cool air. The evenings spent playing fetch in the backyard, Maggie's joyful barks echoing through the neighborhood. The nights when he'd wake up to find both dogs had somehow managed to squeeze themselves onto his bed, a warm, comforting presence in the darkness. As the years passed, Maggie's golden coat began to show streaks of white, and Max matured from a gangly adolescent into a dignified adult dog. But their spirits remained as bright as ever, and their impact on the community only grew. The forest where John had first found Maggie and her puppies began to heal, new growth sprouting from the charred earth. It became a favorite spot for John, Maggie, and Max to visit, a powerful reminder of where their journey had begun. On one such visit, as they stood in a clearing that had once been engulfed in flames, John found himself overcome with emotion. He knelt down, wrapping an arm around each dog. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you for everything." Maggie and Max, as if understanding, pressed closer to him, their presence a warm, solid comfort. And in that moment, surrounded by the renewing forest and embraced by the dogs who had changed his life, John knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The story of a brave mother dog and the firefighter who saved her had become legend in Salem and beyond. But for John, Maggie, and Max, it wasn't about the legend. It was about the love, the family, and the hope they had found in each other. It was about the lives they touched and the changes they inspired. And it was about the unbreakable bond between humans and animals, a bond that could spark a flame of hope bright enough to light up the darkest of times. As they made their way home that day, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, John felt a profound sense of peace. Whatever challenges the future might hold, he knew they would face them together, a family forged in fire, bound by love, and dedicated to spreading hope wherever they went. In the heart of Salem, a statue now stood in the park, a golden retriever with a small puppy by her side, an enduring tribute to Maggie's bravery and the power of compassion. And in homes across Oregon and beyond, dogs rescued through Maggie's Flame of Hope cuddled with their new families, their lives forever changed by the ripple effect of one brave dog's journey. As for John, Maggie, and Max, they continued their work, their days filled with love, purpose, and the joy of being together. Their story, which had begun in the smoke and flames of a wildfire, had blossomed into something beautiful, a testament to the resilience of the spirit, the healing power of love, and the extraordinary capacity of ordinary beings to make a difference in the world. And so, in a cozy house in Salem, with a golden retriever and her son sleeping peacefully at the foot of his bed, John Miller drifted off to sleep each night, grateful for the unexpected turns that had led him to this moment. In the quiet of the night, as Maggie's soft snores filled the room, he knew that this unconventional, beautiful, love-filled life was home. And he wouldn't have it any other way.